Chapter 9. The Flashing Line. Well, could David really say he was surprised? 3 days had passed since he had thrown his lot in with Jason, otherwise known in this world as Nex, and his gang of misfits. They were loosely connected to a larger web of similar types, and here he was, learning the ropes. Ashley also decided this was the path she would go down with him, though she took the better part of the first day considering her options, which were just as bleak as tagging along in a nameless organization that the world called terrorists. But learning the ropes was a nice way of saying helping in the back of the charge station with the general goods that were sold in the store. Got to make it look so real that it is real, is what Nex would tell him. That's how they kept the world from prying too deeply into the affairs of the back office. A shady charge station that looked and operated like nothing more than that. David and Ashley's faces were now all over the media outlets, and now local media was essentially the same as nationwide media. Their names and faces had been blown out into the world for all to see. The current message being tagged along with their faces, and names were wanted for medical evaluation, which David knew was the first step before being branded an unbalanced terrorist in the making. But so far as he could see, being a terrorist against the UCA was prepping junk food for shelves, helping review register sales, spending time with Ashley in the hidden lower basement, and reading his father's notebook. Those last two things he enjoyed. Ashley was always a breath of fresh air, and even when she had her occasional breakdown in the middle of the night on the cheap futon they shared, she was worth it. While much of what they were doing was monotonous, David was learning a lot about the organization and how it ran. Typically, loosely considered anyway, the whole thing ran in independent cells of one another. Unless it was a major job, which was few and far between, they had their own ways of running things in different areas. There were a few things that remained consistent for the sake of being sustainable. Each cell had a major central figure, a Nex, or Nexus, who called the shots of their section and dealt out jobs and gigs. They made sure if some big intel got picked up, they printed it out into the forgotten form of a newspaper and dished it out to the other cells. Which brings up the next group, the runners. The name is exactly what you expect it to be. They were responsible for the newspapers and dispersed them about as much as possible. While this task sounded difficult, it wasn't too hard. You could send private mail still, and delivery trucks were always an option. Based off how Nex explained it, the runners had spent a long time creating a healthy and sneaky ecosystem to get the papers out to the entire network. Gil, the crooked-toothed man from the first day, was one of 10 runners in Jason's Nexus. He was the runner, and he liked to make sure you knew. We send out 9 trucks that all are loaded with the papers. They all go out into the UCA. No one ever takes the same path back-to-back times. Then they drop off and pick up. They do this until they get back here. By the time they get back here, all they got left in the truck is papers from other networks. Then there was the Drummer Boys. Although not all Drummer Boys were boys, it was just a title. The Drummer Boys were different than any other part of the organization. They didn't belong to any one cell. They went around the entire UCA and picked up all intel they could. They could be any one person at any given time. They never acted on anything, only passed information along to the Nexus, who then decided what to do with the information. If it was information that led to possible countermeasures, that's when the last group came into play. The operators were the final group. These were in the field types. They pulled off or attempted to pull off various assaults against the corporate authority. The risk-takers had various abilities ranging from basic combat skills, computer and network hacking capabilities, the occasional honeypot, assassination, and yes, if need be, bombing. David learned from both his conversations with Nex and his reading of his father's notebook that his father was an operator. Reading his father's notebook also gave him a place to disappear into. It was like stepping into a time machine and listening to someone who had a similar, yet darker understanding of this new world. David learned that his father was a funny guy, though he was so angry that he probably never took the time to enjoy that part of himself. His father came back from a war in which what David was beginning to understand from the reading and being around Jason was every couple of years thing back in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It was mostly silent, alternative-type wars, where the government of the UCA claimed they were fighting for the country's interests, while they sent young men and women off for corporate gains and consolidation of resources and power. It was during the war his father and Jason were in that they removed the ban of drafting women into service. This was met in the barracks with some major issues. As his father put it in words, nobody really cared or didn't care if a girl was in the platoon. But when you have angry young men from all walks of life stuck in a place being trained to kill, and all they end up seeing through their poor, desperate, angry eyes is an easy mark for unwanted fun. People started running around camp in cliques, and some of those cliques were filled with really bad apples. It's easy to think what they wanted to do to a new girl who just landed her boots in Camp Zero. Camp Zero was the unofficial name of the training boot camp his father and his friends were at. It was called Camp Zero by the young kids there because you had zero fucking chance of going back home. It was a much bleaker version of the life David had lived up to that point. His military service sucked, yeah, but all the warmongering was done by the time he served. In fact, the last war he could remember was nearly 15 years back when North Korea was officially annexed by China. The UCA took part in that war as China's ally. In fact, when the new wave of nuclear energy power plants became commonplace in the UCA, China was one of the first countries wanting to work hand in hand with the UCA and the companies that built the plants. No war was needed for that merger. He learned about his father's meeting with his version of Nex, a guy with no legs and a serious drinking problem and a raid head. The Nex of 2029 was drowning his sorrows and then cranking Brain Raid, a new wave drug filled with all kinds of crap David never cared about. He knew it had something to do with meth and Chembal and other assorted narcotics. It was known to literally make someone clinically brain dead over a time. But the guy was a big-time believer in the corrupt system theory. He got linked in with a bunch of other angry, shadowy types and began to make a space for the organization in this area. His usage of Brain Raid was typical, as David's father saw it back then. Chembal was being pressed and expanded to the public at a shocking rate, but it was not yet uncommon to not be on the drug then. During that time, a lot of people, like the legless Nex, just wanted to escape from it all, and did so with hard drugs. On the fourth day, as David and Ashley opened delivery boxes of charge station junk food and drinks, Trace was on his computer in the back. Trace, or, as David internally referred to him, the Weasel, was Nex's hacker and general tech. Trace, aka the Weasel, was about 32 years old. He was a troubled youth growing up, shocker, and was already up to a Chembal dose count of 5 by age 15. They were talking about re-education when they realized 5 wasn't going to cut it, recalled Trace one day, in the back to David and Ashley. So I fucking bailed on youth shelter. They just wanted me to not be their problem anymore. I ditched that joint, hopped all the way from the UCA West Commonwealth all the way here. That's when Nex found me and gave me a direction to focus my anger. David couldn't really be too shocked. Trace's story was not unheard of among this lot. Gil, the crooked-toothed man from the same day, didn't even know his parents. His mother died in one of those early 21st century wars, and his father blew his brains out. He didn't want to take care of a baby by himself, I figured, said Gil one night as they ate crappy charge station food. So, I spent my youth in the 25th Common House Authority of the Central Commonwealth. When I was 16, I got out and stumbled my way down here, and Nex found me. It would seem for all these people, Jason, or the allure of Nex, was something of a beacon of hope in a shitstorm that ravaged the world. The world was broken with seedy hidden agendas, and the fallout of the structure that was built to sustain it left a lot of angry young people seeking to throw a stone at the ruling class. Nex and this organization wanted to do the same thing. As David pondered this in the back office, listening to Trace type away and fight to breathe through his broken nose, his line of thought was interrupted with the sudden flash of a headache. He winced at the pain and pulled out a few capsules of Tylenol. Trace noticed and looked over. Better get used to popping painkillers. It'll be a while before you won't get those headaches. Even still, anytime you find yourself in public around anything connected to the power plant grid, your pussy-ass head will start throbbing, Trace said with a blood-stuffed nose, which made his voice sound more comical than the first day David met him. Everyone gets headaches around anything connected to the grid? Asked Ashley, as she softly put a hand over David's, and before David had the chance to say something witty and funny about Trace's nose job. Trace looked at her and pulled himself away from his computer just a little so he could turn his whole body towards them. Yeah, ain't nobody too sure why or how. We got some theories, But the tech companies that own the plants and the tech married too, it keep that shit under major lockdown, said Trace. How major? Asked David, curious now about the headaches and less so about Trace's nose. Like Ashley's tits not coming out of that shirt, Major. Trace replied with a smirk on his face. You keep playing your cards right, Trace. I might just rearrange your nose again, David said with a pang of anger rising in his voice. Trace looked hard back at him, but a split second of wavering in his eyes showed that he didn't want another fight to spill out, especially in the back office of Nex's station. Mention my tits again, Ashley said pointily, and you won't have to worry about your fucked nose ever again. You'll be missing a much smaller piece. Trace rolled his eyes. Yeah, real nice joke about my dick size when you ain't even ever seen it. How original. Trace turned back to his computer and went back to typing, and even David had to admit, that small dick line was a tired line. But at least Ashley stood her own ground. The last couple days had been a steep learning curve for her, being surrounded by people like Trace and Gil. There were others too, constantly in and out, but Gil and Trace seemed to be around the most, as well as Anna, the teenage girl who seemed to be in training like David and Ashley. The learning curve was also steep for David, but any time he found himself in a hot situation, he just recalled old movies. Often it worked out well for him. It was shocking how simplistic the minds of these people were. He struggled with Anna, though. She was a tough one to get the better of. That young teenage angst without Chembal to fog her thoughts made for a challenging opponent. Just then, Nex stepped into the back office with a man in a suit. David hadn't recognized the man, and for a moment was worried he was SDT. Flashbacks of the events he ran from the fat and buff agents rushed back at him, and a moment of panic set in before Nex started to move casually over to his desk. The man in the suit looked over at David and Ashley and just smiled and nodded, then followed Nex over to the desk. Trace looked over his shoulder for a moment, then went back to his digital world. Nex grabbed a cigarette and his classic whiskey-laced coffee drink, then looked up at the man. What a drink, he asked, offering the bottle towards the man. No thanks, he said in a smooth East Coast accent. I gotta hit the flash back to my neck of the woods, but the word on the dangle is you wanted some serious intel. I found it, figured I'd toss it your way. The man pulled out a manila folder with some documents paperclipped inside and tossed it on Nex's desk. Nex popped the paperclip and tossed it off to the side, opening the papers and taking a quick once-over. This legit then? He asked in his deep, hard voice, not showing an ounce of emotion. The man in the suit replied, Yeah, real legit, you know how I work. I know you work in 35% legit and 65% bullshit, Dez. I ain't a mark, is this legit or not? Nex replied, looking the man in the suit called Dez right in the face. Listen, Nex, you are right, I do deal in a lot of bullshit, but that's with the outside man. When I stick my neck out for the org, I deal strictly in the legit, Dez said. Nex looked down again at the papers, then back up at Dez. All right, Dez, I'll give you standard finder's fee for the intel, plus I'll pay for your traveling expense. If it turns out to be legit, you'll be compensated further. If it turns out to be said bullshit, I will personally come find you out there in the HOS Commonwealth and make an example out of you for the other drummers, you understand? Dez smiled back at Nex, showing that he wasn't worried about the latter. I understand, Nex. As a professional in this game, I understand. And I promise the only thing that's going to go down from here on my end is you giving me that little extra something. He turned around and made his way to the door, paused, and looked over at Ashley and David. I must say, Nex, I'm surprised you kept these two around here for this long. The SDT got their faces all over the local media and news. But it ain't none of my biz. With that, he walked out and closed the door behind him. David looked over at Nex, who was smoking a new cigarette and scratching the side of his nose, looking down at the papers left by the man known as Dez. Trace broke the silence, as he tended to do. I hate Dez's stupid-ass zoot suit crap, pretending he's some big-time thing when all he is some up-jump drummer boy from the East Coast. David looked over at Trace and asked, That dude was a drummer boy. Huh, I always figured they looked, I don't know, like street rat type kids. Not some dude in a goofy baggy suit. Ashley looked at him with her forehead wrinkled up, letting him know how stupid that sounded. Trace put it into words for everyone there. What part of any one person at any one time was lost on you, man? If every drummer boy was Oliver Twist, it would be pretty easy to figure out, don't you think? David's face was lit up with shock, as was Ashley's. "You actually know what Oliver Twist is?" asked Ashley, with shock in her voice. Trace made a sound like he was trying to snort, but the broken nose stopped it, and he turned back to the computer. David couldn't believe Trace could read, but it made sense considering he was a computer whiz for Nex. He looked over at Nex and asked, "What is it?" Nex looked up at David, having been snapped out of a deep thought process. "A job I've been trying to get together for some time," sighed Nex. "Really?" asked David. Seemed odd that a job Nex had been working on would amount to a couple sheets of paper brought all the way from the HOS Commonwealth by a man in a zoot suit. Nex leaned back, looked over at Trace and said, "Trace, come look this over. Tell me what you think." Trace stood up and grabbed his current big gulp drink with him. He sipped on it as he looked down at the first paper on Nex's desk. Then his forehead crinkled, and he shot a quick glance at Nex. Then he looked back down and flipped over to the next sheet, continuing through all the sheets. He studied them for a moment, then took his mouth off the straw of his drink. "How in the great tits of Mother Teresa did that East Coast slime ball get this?" asked Trace with a clear sound of awe in his voice. "I don't know. I don't care. What I want to know is what do you think?" asked Nex impatiently. Trace looked back down, then back at Nex, and cracked a smile that was as broken as his nose. "It's legit FWK for the DOE, man," he said with the sound of a young boy learning something new about his favorite toy. Nex just shook his head, then said, "We need to start prep then. This is going to go down one way or another." Trace looked back at him in shock. "Hey man, this is best thing that could have fallen in our lap for this, but we still don't get the operators for this type of gig Nex. I'm good, but even with the FWK, I will still need protection." "Shit man, who knows? Even if we can get in to use the thing." David interrupted Trace's rambling. He was confused as all get out about the events playing out before him. Whoa, new guy and gal over on this side of the shadow organization here. What's FWK and DOE? And why does it matter to this super serious gig?" Trace shot a look at David like what he said was the dumbest thing anyone had ever said in Trace's presence. David found it hard to imagine considering how dumb Trace seemed, and the people he had been around before. "FWK," started Trace, "is the short way to say firewall killer, and the DOE stands for the Department of Energy, which is fucking laughable that you didn't know being a former model-fed employee," Trace said with an edge of mock in his tone. "Oh, shut it down, Trace. I don't got the energy to listen to a pissing contest over trivia shit," said Nex. Then he looked over at Ashley and David. "It's something I've been trying to put together for a couple months, to break through the firewall of the DOE and peek at what they got hidden. It's one of the biggest shadows in our government, and a lot of the other Fed departments seem to link back to it some way or another, which means it got intel that could be important to our fight. You think once you break through the DOE with the FWK, you can learn more about the PowerPlants, don't you?" asked Ashley. Nex nodded. "Everything about all this leads back to the plants, the security, the laws, the current model citizen, even the drugs. It's all to protect those giant plants where they lock away secrets and slave labor. We want to bring down the system. We got to hit them right in the damn heart." Suddenly, Anna came through the door to the back office with a look of panic on her young face, removing all the angst that typically preoccupied it. "Jason!" she hissed. "The SDT are here! They are coming to the front door!" Nex stood up as David, Ashley, and Trace all seemed to go white and stiff in fear. Nex headed for the door. "You three stay back here. Don't open this door, and if you hear me fumbling with the handle like I'm trying to unlock it, hide in the hidden wall." Then he walked through the door with Anna and shut it behind him. The three of them stood there for a moment, as if not moving would make them invisible to the naked eye. It was Ashley who whispered the first words. "Why are we just standing here staring at each other like buffoons?" David and Trace looked at each other, neither having a good answer as to why they felt the need to stand like statues. Then David relaxed his body some and lit a cigarette, hoping to instill a level of cool back to his demeanor. He had worked hard on developing a certain image these last couple days, and aside from Ashley, no one really knew the type of guy David had been before the incident in the front of the charge station on the first day. "Do the cameras out there work, Trace?" he asked, masking his nerves as best he could. Trace nodded. He was still stiff and seemed worried to use his voice, but then he said, Yeah, they work. Why?" "Oh, my Trace, look who's asking the dumbass questions now," Because I want to know what the agents look like and what they say to Nex. Trace reacted by slowly moving to his chair and flipping through a few screens on his monitor. Then he brought up the front store camera and very lightly turned on the volume. The agents walked through the front door, and David knew immediately why they were there for. It was the fat agent and the buff agent. The fat one looked not much different than the first time he saw him, except maybe for some stubble on his face. The buff agent's facial swelling had gone down some, but his nose still bore the gash across it from when David plowed his fist into it at the office. They walked up to the counter and came face to face with Anna. The fat one spoke. "We are looking for the shift manager or owner, whomever may be in Hun." Anna, doing her best to act like a model teen, shouted out towards the other side of the station. "Hey Jason, some men are here looking for you." Nex had positioned himself in one of the aisles, pretending to be taking inventory stock. By the look of his movements, David figured this was not his first go with the SDT in this manner. Nex walked over, and as the agents turned to face him, he did not break his stride as he walked behind the counter by Anna. "Go ahead and pick up where I left off over there. I was in the gum and mints section," he said simply to her. She nodded and took off towards the same aisle he came from. Then Nex spoke to the agents. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he said, as if they didn't reek of professional business. The fat one smiled at him. "Good to meet you, Jason, is it? I'm Agent Anderson. This is my partner, Agent Madsen. We work with the SDT, and we're hoping you might be able to shed some light on a sensitive subject for us." Nex just nodded and replied, "Anything I can offer, I will. But as you can tell, I get a lot of activity around here. Good and bad." The buff agent, Agent Madsen, crossed his arms as the fat one, Agent Anderson, kept talking. He was clearly the senior in the partnership, it seemed to David. "Of course, I understand. But you see, it's about a recent event, and I'm sure you would have heard of it. About 4 days ago, some unbalanced individuals had a mental breakdown episode in a federal building. As of right now, they are simply wanted for medical assistance, as they are prescribed Chembal users and apparently have stopped. They are a danger to themselves and their surroundings." Nex just shook his head. David noticed he did that a lot, and wondered if it was a way to make people feel like he was listening, or if it was some sort of nervous twitch. "That does sound bad, but truth be told, I get a lot of people in here that don't keep up to date on their prescriptions, if they even have any. In this neighborhood, you try to just stay out of certain things, makes business easier," Nex said. Right, you see. The issue is with these two, they have already shown early signs of criminal activity. My partner's face, the actions of an unbalanced madman who struck out as we attempted to help get himself back on the right track. As for the woman, well, she drove through the streets causing several wrecks and nearly killing several people in the process. Tell me, Jason, does this car look familiar about 4 days past? Agent Anderson pulled a picture out of his coat pocket to reveal an image of Ashley's car prior to the chase. Nex took it from his hands and studied it. Then he made a kind of struggling sigh sound and looked back up to the agents. To be honest, it's a new model with a bright color job. These types of cars come in to charge up here occasionally, but they don't linger. Again, this area isn't friendly to those who are not from around here. The agent who called himself Anderson smiled that same wolfish smile he showed David in that conference room 4 days prior. Interesting. You see, it's interesting to me because I've been busting my ass, Jason. I mean really busting my ass looking up and down this town for this car and the people that were in it. The crazy part? Poof. It's just gone. I can't find it anywhere. But then some near brain-dead brain raider a block down from here told me he saw a yellow car dragging the top pull in here a couple days ago. Pretty weird, right? Ashley grabbed onto David's arm hard, and David felt a lump rising in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Oh fuck. Trace began mumbling as he rocked back and forth in his chair. If they force Nex to let them look around, or worse, they take him for questioning, it's game over, man. He whispered to Ashley and David, fear and horror rising in his voice. Nex kept his vacant, somewhat annoyed, yet somehow mean resting face on, though. The man was doing good under pressure, David noted. You mean to tell me a raider on the street told you that? Let me guess. Did he have patchwork hair, missing teeth, and missing his left eye and half his nose? Asked Nex. As a matter of fact, he was yes, said the one called Anderson. Before he could continue, however, the buff one, Madsen, finally entered the conversation. Let me guess, This is the part you tell us the junkie is unreliable information source in some way, right? Because you know these streets and we don't, correct? He said in a monotone voice that rivaled Nex's. Nex just looked from the fat Anderson to the tall Madsen and said, something like that, yeah. I've seen and heard him do a lot for a hit of brain raid. But what I was going to say is it's possible the car came through here. But people can pay at the charge ports. They don't gotta walk in. Furthermore, I believe this has something to do with the people who have been on the news, right? You would be correct, yes, Anderson said. Right. The problem is, they looked like Fed stiffs. All of them look alike to me at my age. Even if they came in to pay, I didn't know who they were then, and I damn sure didn't memorize their faces, Nex declared. David let out some air. He realized he had been holding it. Watching Nex navigate this conversation was becoming very impressive. Madsen stuck a finger out right at the camera that was watching them. What about that? Maybe you got some footage that could be more useful than this line of bullshit. All right now. Madsen, let's not insult the man. I did some quick research on you, Jason Hardy. Former military combat injury, came back home, got into some bad places with some bad people. David got worried again. Anderson was proving to be a bigger issue than he appeared in physical form. Just briefly, you would assume he was some fat, limping moron with a ruddy nose from a drinking problem. But apparently, compared to his angry, muscle-bound partner, he was the strategic one. Then around, 30 years ago, give or take, you get ownership of this place through the death of another injured military vet who willed it to you. Suddenly, you went clean and narrow. Tell me that had to be a challenge, to cut out all those people with bad habits, the tubby Anderson said as he leaned onto the register counter to get closer to Nex's face. Even though the computer was older, the image was clear, and you could see Nex was still holding his cool, but anger was boiling in his eyes. Don't worry about it. I love a good Cinderella story myself, a man who overcame the odds and put himself back on his feet. But my partner has a good point. It would be good for your story and for you to stay on those feet if we could see those cameras. Nex looked back at the Lard Anderson and said, they aren't connected to anything. If you need me to, I can take you to the back office and show you that much, if it'll spare me the annoyance of being called a liar. Anderson smiled at that wolf grin and shook his chins up and down. I would appreciate that very much, good sir. As soon as that was said, Trace flipped the screen over, typed quickly, and then pressed enter. The screen turned into a frozen black screen. As he was doing that, David wasted no time either. He ran over to the wall where the hidden entrance was and removed the panel. Trace dashed for the opening, and Ashley began to make her way towards it as well. Then the handle started to jingle like Nex said it would. Ashley stopped, looked over at Nex's desk and dashed towards it. David almost wanted to yell out, "What the hell are you doing?" but stopped himself when he realized how dumb that would be and when he saw what she was grabbing. The folder brought in by Dez, with the FWKs and the DOE intel on it. They rushed behind the wall panel and quickly placed it back in the spot where it was not easily seen apart from the rest of the room. Then the door opened. The three of them huddled in the same space in the wall between the panel and the door that connected to the stairs that led to the small apartment. None of them moved or made a sound as they listened to the footsteps of Nex leading the agents into the room. The position David was in gave him a faint line of sight into the room that let him see Nex's desk, but not much else. There was a moment of silence as the footsteps stopped, somewhere in the middle of the room. "Where do the cameras link up to?" asked the voice of Madsen. "To that relic right there. It was here when I got the place. Never cared to remove it or update it," came Nex's voice in reply. David heard offbeat steps and knew the fat Anderson with the limp was moving somewhere in the room. "Now I have not seen something so old since I was a kid," he laughed. "Does that thing even run on nuclear power, or is that thing running on a potato?" He followed up. "Pretty sure it's from before computers got the nuclear power charges. It was here before me. What you see on screen is what you get with it," said Nex. "How do you handle crime or attempted robbery without security footage?" came the monotoned voice of Madsen. "Believe it or not, but like the news says, crime is low in today's world. As for any marks dumb enough to try and hit this joint, I made an example or two back in the early years, out of a few would-be thieves. Word in the neighborhood gets around, and I don't have to worry much." There was another moment of silence after Nex's explanation, then the sound of footsteps again. Someone started messing with the computer. It must have yielded no results because it ended shortly after. Then Anderson spoke up again. "What's with the newspapers?" It was the most direct question he had asked yet. Again, Nex was quick to reply. "The former owner was a hoarder. I was close to him. When he died and left me the place, there was a lot of crap. Some of it felt wrong to remove. He had a thing for newspapers. I cleared off that desk right there for myself and left the rest, mostly as is." "Look," came Nex's voice again after a brief pause. "I was reckless as a young guy, who wasn't before everyone got prescribed Chembal. But I'm in my 50s now, have lost a lot of people, and just live in my little world now. I don't know where your marks went. If I did, I would tell you. I have too much to lose at this stage in my life." Even David was shocked. The sound in Nex's voice seemed so true and honest that it would take a lie detector test to fish out that was a lie. Even then, he thought Nex might not fool them. After a second or two more of silence, the sounds of Madsen's feet started towards the door. Then came Anderson's voice. "Thank you, Jason. Tell you what, I'll leave my number here. If something clicks in that head of yours about the events of that day, you just give me a ring, all right?" Then Anderson's uneven steps began to move towards the door, followed by Nex's. It was 20 minutes before he came back to the office and let them know it was safe to come out. "Holy shit, Nex, that was heavy," wheezed a still-shaken Trace. Ashley cocked her brow at him and said, "Thought you were supposed to be some big-time operator here." 2 SDT agents show up, one of them an obese middle-aged man, and you get phased? Trace shot a hard face back at her, his broken nose managing to get even more red. "In case you ain't wise to it, girl, this joint is a central point. Say we got from 0 to 2 SDT agents here, then what? You think we can just stay? Nah, the whole op gets uphinged and moved around. Which means heat for us from the SDT, and our runners and drummer boys gotta find us." "Uphinged isn't really a word, Trace," David said with a sweet and innocent smile. "I believe the word is uprooted. You mixed it with unhinged, which is a word for being mentally unbalanced." Trace shot his gaze back at David and opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by Nex. "For Christ's sake, is this an elementary playground? Trace, the word was wrong. Shut your mouth unless you need to breathe through it and listen up, all of you." The tone in his deep voice was shockingly harder than usual, and it took even David by surprise. He looked at all three of them, lit a cigarette, which led to David lighting one, then spoke. "I'm going to make some calls tonight. Tomorrow morning plan on the 3 of you heading out. Trace, take your gear, all the tech crap you'll need for fieldwork, but light enough to be unnoticed. Anything you need when you get to where you are going will be provided there. David, Ashley, the truth is, I should have moved you along to another safe house 2 days ago. But I had my reasons. They were personal, so don't ask why. But things change." David tried to jump in real quick. "Hey man, I'm not..." Nex cut him off, not hearing it. "You two are going with Trace." That shut David up again, and he saw Ashley's face had gone white for a moment. Trace spoke up. "You want me to run this job with 2 people who have no experience? Duh fuck Nex?" Nex just looked at him. "Nobody here has experience with this type of gig, Trace. They escaped the SDT twice and took you and Gil and my lot out there, so I'd say they will be fine. The 3 of you will be taking the flashing line to the HOS Commonwealth. Rest up tonight, you are hitting the DOE." David did not rest that night. Instead, he sat up reading his father's notebook and smoking. He flipped to a part where his father explained the first gig he ran for the next of his time. It was a simple one. Jason, Eddie, and Vance ran it with him. They studied a chem farm factory's delivery routes, then in teams of 2 hit 6 trucks in the span of 12 hours. Truckloads of Chembal. His father was at first worried this wasn't the right thing to do. If the sheep want to sleep, who am I to say they can't? He decided he had to do it. Not for the people, he didn't care about that, but I just don't know, man. This all feels wrong, the way the world is. My son doesn't belong in what it is becoming. They pulled the gig off. They torched the trucks that were carrying large amounts of Chembal, with the only regret being having to watch one security officer die when he pulled a gun on Eddie. The next morning, David, Ashley, and Trace put on simple attire, hoodies, and jeans. They hoped it would help keep them hidden in plain sight, allowing them to blend in with the crowd. Hoodies were a popular attire, so people were less likely to look at them. David knew this because when he was on Chembal, that's how he reacted to hooded people. He grabbed 3 bottles of Tylenol because, as Trace put it, Yeah, we may not be chem dogs anymore, but after 20 minutes on the flash, you are gonna be popping pills anyways. David had never been on the flashing line. It was a model of modern technology fused with the old. More or less, it was a complex hyper-fast train system. It was created by the UCA, China, and New Japan. Each country had one of the robust and complex systems integrated as being part of the development. All powered by the PowerPlants, so they touted its clean, fast, and fun experience for all to enjoy. You could, in theory, travel on the flashing line, or as people called it, the Flash, from the west coast of the UCA, all the way to New York on the east in 6 hours, topping well over 400 miles per hour. It wasn't cheap, though. Even from where they were in the Central West Commonwealth, it would cost just under $2,000 per person. Ashley had been on the Flash before, and so had Trace for gigs in the past, but never up to the head of state, never been there. He mumbled as they took off in an old beater of a car. The car was a classic non-nuclear powered gas burner. They weren't outlawed or anything like that. But when the sale of gas was outlawed, it made finding one in public that much rarer. Ashley mentioned on several occasions as they drove that they would get made in this car. But luck was with them in this area as they got to the drop-off spot for the car. David left the keys in the ignition as instructed by Nex, and they walked half a block to the flashing line station. People in nice outfits walked aimlessly around them as they walked with purpose towards the station. David could feel his father's pistol in his waistline. How stupid of me, David thought to himself. I should have asked Nex for a freaking holster. This is going to suck. Trace noticed the gun bulging as they walked and pulled Ashley and David off to an ally. Give me the gun shooter, he said to David in a hushed voice. For what? I know how to shoot a gun, numbnuts. I had to serve like everybody at 18. David said in protest. Really did Trace think David was this green? Trace looked around them quickly. Yeah, that's cute and shit. Listen, genius. You get flagged down and checked at security with that we go nowhere but re-education camps or reassignment at a plant. I got a scanner scrambler in my bag to hide the not-so-clean shit I'm packing. So put it in the bag so we get to make it to D.C. For once, David felt silly in an argument with Trace. He couldn't believe he didn't think of the security measures beforehand. But then again, it was something he never had to think of when he was doped up. He put the gun in the bag with the 2 clips, and they continued back on track to the station. Once inside, they got into the ticket line. It was like going to Disney World during peak season. Everyone that wanted to go somewhere seemed to want to use the Flash. From families on trips to stare and gawk at old buildings in NYC, yawn, to businessmen and women trying to make it to some conference here or there. The ones that really caught David's eyes, though, were the super wealthy. There was only a handful that you could easily spot, but they acted differently than the rest. Sure, they got special treatment. They seemed to already have tickets and got to skip this wait-in-line process, but the way they carried themselves. They seemed, in a selfish, piggish way, more humanistic than the rest of the people here. David leaned over to Ashley and Trace and mumbled, "Look at them. Look at how they move. They aren't taking any drugs prescribed by a doctor that they don't want to." Trace snorted, leaned his head back, and through a wheezing nose mumbled back, "Crazy, what you see when you step outside the lines, isn't it?" They waited for 3 hours, at one point worried they may miss the ride from this station to the DC station. But they arrived in time to pay with cash for 3 one-way tickets. They even had 15 minutes before boarding time. "Hey," David called out to Ashley and Trace. "I'm going to get a smoke in before the final call, okay?" Trace just nodded and kept going, but Ashley turned back and said, "Okay, but remember, platform 87, line box 5. Don't be late. It takes off as soon as the doors close." David nodded as he turned to walk to the small section reserved for smokers. As he lit his cigarette and smoked it, he continued to study the people around him. How so easily corralled, thought David to himself. Everyone besides the 3 of them, and maybe 10 others, who were so wealthy, it didn't matter. The cost of anything were so glazed over with simple distractions. They seemed to have empty smiles, and no family had more than 1 kid, if that even. A lot of what he saw were slightly overweight middle-aged people. Some married, some not, a few blank-staring kids. The occasional loud screaming child who the parents nervously tried to shove Chembal into their food or drinks to get them to take the pills and calm down in public. It all was so fake he hated it. Sheer hatred, and he wanted to smash it down, and as the people who built it. He took his last long drag, looked at the time, and crushed the cigarette. As he looked up to start walking, he paused instantly, because standing right in front of him, with a just-lit cigarette, stood an equally shocked Agent Anderson. There was no time to think. He ran up as quickly as he could and drove his fist with all the hatred. He just fell inside, into Anderson's fat, sweaty face. He felt blood, sweat, and spit cover his hand as Anderson went down, and he took off without looking back. He didn't see the buff Madsen anywhere yet. If he was lucky, he wouldn't, before he got on the Flash. He passed several platforms before getting to platform 87. Sighed as he slowed down, saw Ashley and Trace in line box 5, and as he got ready to step in, was yanked back by the hood of his hoodie. He was slammed up against a pillar by the Flash, with the big right hand of Madsen squarely choking the ever-living shit out of him. "F off," was the only sounds David could make. Madsen's bruised, angry face stared coldly at him, pulled out his tranq gun, and aimed it in David's stomach. Well, thought David, he's either going to choke me to sleep or shoot me there. David's field of vision tightened as he began to see stars behind his eyes. Within seconds, David simultaneously began hearing a buzzing sound, as his flaying punches had no effect on Madsen, and David began to feel himself losing muscle control. Suddenly, David felt the sweet rush of air as he realized that Madsen had let go abruptly. David fell gasping for air and looked around. Trace had grabbed a metal trash can lid and banged it on the back of Madsen's head. He wasn't knocked out, but clearly unfocused and dazed. "Now or never, bitch. This thing is taking off. Your buddy won't be happy about the new lump," yelled Trace. Trace had never had a more accurate statement than right that moment, thought David to himself.